Hey everyone, so today we're going to discuss the landmine press through a neuromechanical lens and discuss how we can use this landmine pressing strategy to develop overhead pressing qualities, particularly while we're holding on to the capacity to dissociate within the rotational plane, within the transverse plane, between the scapula and the humerus particularly, okay? Because as we're learning to produce force, particularly when we're trying to produce high levels of force, we do want the segments to have the capacity to move in the same direction, to not allow for any rotational dissociation where the segments are rotating in opposing directions as we flex the arm overhead. And we'll discuss that in more detail throughout the video. But that's particularly important when we're producing high levels of force, when we're trying to express maximal motor output, when the nervous system has to express high levels of neural drive, increased levels of motor output into the muscular tissues. When we're pressing overhead, we don't want too much rotational movement between interacting segments, okay? But during the rehab process, particularly when we focus early on in the rehab process towards restoring dissociation between interacting segments, we want to try and hold on to those dissociation qualities for as long as we can as we begin to produce higher and higher levels of force. Because holding on to those dissociation capacities as we produce higher and higher levels of force allows us to maintain some level of movement options, a wider scope of movement options as we begin to produce higher levels of force, okay? And then eventually, once we begin to produce maximal forces, if it's necessary for the clients, then we don't necessarily need to hold on to a wider scope of movement options to manage forces and manage perturbations. So this idea almost represents a phased transition during the rehab process, where earlier on during the rehab process, we're trying to restore the capacity of the system to manage perturbations, manage forces, distribute forces, and now we're transitioning towards a phase where we're relearning how to produce forces, higher and higher levels of force, but as we're beginning to produce those forces, we're trying to maintain those dissociation capacities. So as we're developing overhead pressing qualities, we essentially need the humerus to have the capacity to flex under load. And when we're pressing vertically overhead, and even pressing straight ahead in a horizontal plane, we need humeral flexion to be able to couple with extension of the elbow, okay? Now, when we're pressing vertically overhead, we're going to see that coupling of humeral flexion with elbow extension later on, but during a landmine press, where there's more of a horizontal component to it, we're going to see that humeral flexion and elbow extension coupling sooner during the press. And that earlier coupling between humeral flexion and elbow extension makes it much easier for us to control the coordination of the scapula as we press overhead. Because as we're pressing overhead, particularly if we're trying to flex the humerus, we want the humerus to stay in the sagittal plane. If we want the humerus to stay in the sagittal plane, we need the scapula to have the capacity to internally rotate and protract so the glenoid cavity faces forward. And in order to maintain the humerus in the sagittal plane and maintain a grasp on the barbell in front, we need the humerus to express more of a relative external rotation of the humerus, the humeral segment. So that's what represents that dissociation capacity essentially, is that internal rotation of the scapula and that relative external rotation of the humerus as we flex the humerus overhead, okay? What we want to try to reduce is that early internal rotation of the humerus as we flex overhead. That would represent that those segments are moving in the same direction in the transverse plane. We want to try and delay that because eventually towards the end range of shoulder flexion or humeral flexion, that's when we'll be able to internally rotate the humerus. But what we often see is people internally rotating the humerus too quickly. That represents a lack of dissociation between the scapula and humerus, which as a result represents a reduction or a narrowing of those movement options, that scope of movement options that we want to manage and control forces and perturbations as we're producing forces during this transition in rehab. So let's look at what this looks like during the videos. So let's look at it through a perspective of what we don't want to happen when we're challenging this capacity. And that's this early internal rotation of the humerus as we're pressing overhead. So as I'm pressing here, you'll notice this early internal rotation of the humerus. And one of the most common reasons for this is that the client is potentially unable to appropriately protract and internally rotate the scapula. So they're internally rotating the humerus too much or much more, to drag the scapula into internal rotation. So essentially both segments are moving in the same direction in the transverse plane as we're pressing overhead. And again, this is not necessarily a bad strategy, but it's typically one that's often reserved for higher levels of force production when both segments are moving in the same direction in the transverse plane. And if it's the only way that they can perform overhead pressing under low load, then it likely represents that they don't have the capacity to maintain those dissociation qualities. And so here is what we do want to try to facilitate, ultimately this protraction of the scapula and the maintenance of that humeral external rotation during the press, and then internally rotating the humerus as it flexes even further towards the end range. Okay, and this represents a delay or a slowing down of that humeral internal rotation and the capacity to maintain dissociation between the scapula and the humerus. So what we can do if the client really struggles early on with this is we can work within a partial range of motion where we're initially just trying to maintain that humeral external rotation for as long as we can as we flex the humerus overhead and then reset back to the starting position. And then we can gradually progress the range from there. And obviously we may have to regress and look more locally at the ribcage, scapula and humerus before we progress into something like this as well, to really ensure that we have appropriate dissociation qualities without the addition of load. So you can see how the landmine press is a great way to develop those early overhead pressing qualities. But one of the key things is understanding the neurological features during low force output and high force output. So during low force output, we're putting a bit more emphasis on maintaining those dissociation qualities that we've developed earlier during the rehab process, to maintain a scope of options, a wider scope of options, to simultaneously manage perturbations and other forces impacting our system. And then as we develop higher levels of force output, we don't really need to worry about maintaining those association qualities between interacting segments. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. And if you'd like to learn more about these concepts, be sure to check out one of our courses.